Caiaphas had won. At least that's what it looked like. The body was in the tomb, the stones sealed with the Roman imperial seal, the guards in position. The most calculating political mind Israel had ever seen had executed his plan with surgical precision. The threat was gone. The movement was leaderless. But 40 days later, the same man who removed Pontius Pilate came to Jerusalem and removed Caiaphas with equal efficiency. The calculator had finally met his unknown variable. To understand Caiaphas's fall, you first have to understand the scale of the power he had built. Joseph ben Caiaphas took the office of high priest around the year 18 AD and held it for 18 years, in a role with an extremely high turnover rate. His own father-in-law, Annas, had been removed by the Romans after only 9 years. 18 years represented an extraordinary run that can only be explained by a rare combination of political talent and absolutely cold pragmatism. The high priest was not simply a religious leader. He was the most powerful man in Israel within the system Rome had built to govern Judea. He presided over the Sanhedrin, the 71-member council that functioned as supreme court, legislative body, and the highest religious authority of the Jewish people. He controlled the temple, the economic, spiritual, and cultural center of the nation, which moved enormous sums in taxes, offerings, and the sale of animals for sacrifice. But the most delicate part of the job was diplomacy with Rome. The high priest had to keep the peace between a people deeply proud of their religious identity and an empire with zero tolerance for uprisings. He had to convince Rome that he had the situation under control, and convince his own people that he wasn't simply serving Roman interests. It was a permanent balancing act on a tightrope, and Caiaphas had stayed on that tightrope for 18 consecutive years. When Jesus of Nazareth began drawing crowds, challenging the temple's authority, driving out the money changers, and making claims that placed him above the law itself, Caiaphas did not react with the emotional impulse of a man whose religious standing had been challenged. He reacted with the calculated coldness of a seasoned political operator who had identified a systemic threat and was methodically drawing up the plan to eliminate it. This was a crisis manager, not a man of faith. The Gospel of John preserves a statement from Caiaphas that is one of the most revealing lines in the entire New Testament. When the Sanhedrin gathered to decide what to do about Jesus, after the resurrection of Lazarus created a wave of enthusiasm the religious authorities could no longer ignore, Caiaphas cut through the whole debate with one direct sentence: "You know nothing at all. It is better for you that one man die for the people than the whole nation perish." Cold and precise, stripped of any consideration of innocence or guilt. It wasn't a matter of justice, it was political calculation. One man would die so that a system could survive. The logic of raw power, no religious cover. John records something theologians across the centuries have noticed. Caiaphas said far more than he intended. The prophetic irony is that he described with perfect accuracy what was actually happening, without understanding what he was describing. Caiaphas needed allies. The Pharisees had religious motivations against Jesus, authority over the law, Sabbath interpretation, claims about the temple. The Sadducees, Caiaphas's own group, had political motivations, fear that a popular messianic movement would trigger Roman crackdown and destroy the fragile balance they had maintained for decades. Completely different interests converging on the same urgent goal. That was exactly the kind of material Caiaphas knew how to work with. He also needed precise timing. Passover was the most dangerous moment on the calendar. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims in Jerusalem, religious fervor at its peak. The memory of the Exodus loaded with political meaning that zealots never let pass unnoticed. Any spark could become a fire. But the timing also offered a window. The crowd could be mobilized, pressure applied to Pilate, and if everything moved fast enough, the problem could be eliminated before sundown. The betrayal by Judas was the missing piece. One of Jesus' own disciples offering inside access that would make the arrest possible without a public confrontation. 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave under Mosaic law, and the plan was complete. On the night from Thursday to Friday, while Jesus prayed in Gethsemane, Caiaphas's machine was already moving. The torches were lit. The temple guard was mobilized. Judas went ahead to identify the target with a kiss in the dark. Jesus was taken first to the house of Annas, Caiaphas's father-in-law, the patriarch of the priestly family who still exercised influence even after his formal removal from office. A preliminary interrogation, a formality designed to buy time while Sanhedrin members were summoned for the next session, then to the house of Caiaphas himself. The nighttime trial that followed was, from a legal standpoint, a series of violations of the very Jewish law that Caiaphas was supposed to uphold. Jewish law prohibited criminal trials at night, prohibited sessions on feast days, required the accused to have enough time to prepare a defense, required 2 independent witnesses to agree on the details, and the Gospels record that the witnesses called couldn't get their story straight. Caiaphas presided, knowing every one of these violations, and pushed forward anyway. When the witnesses failed, he made a move that turned the whole proceeding into something else. He stood up, looked directly at Jesus, and asked the question no defendant was required to answer, the one that would automatically incriminate any man who answered yes. "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." And Jesus answered, "You have said so, and I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." That was exactly what Caiaphas needed, and more than he understood. Yes, that gesture, prescribed by law for genuine blasphemy, was at once an expression of religious outrage and a political declaration. It shut down the debate. It made any further deliberation unnecessary. He has blasphemed. What further witnesses do we need? John records that Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, both members of the Sanhedrin, had not agreed with the decision. But their dissent wasn't enough to change the outcome. The verdict had been delivered. All that remained was Pilate's signature. And then what Caiaphas had not calculated happened. The tomb was empty. The stone sealed with the Roman imperial seal had been rolled away. The guards placed there at Caiaphas's own request. He had reminded Pilate of Jesus' prophecy about rising on the 3rd day, had no explanation for what had occurred. His first response was that of a seasoned political operator facing a crisis. Control the narrative before it controls itself. The soldiers were bribed. A story was invented. The disciples had stolen the body while the guards slept. A completely implausible version that required believing Roman soldiers, whose punishment for sleeping on duty was death, had all dozed off together while frightened Galileans rolled away a massive stone without waking anyone. But Caiaphas paid the bribe, and the story spread. The problem was that another story was also spreading, and that one came with witnesses. Many witnesses, men and women claiming to have seen Jesus alive after the crucifixion, describing conversations, shared meals, wounds touched with their own hands. They didn't fit the profile of conspirators, fishermen, women, tax collectors, ordinary people with no power and no political angle. Paul, writing around 55 AD, states that more than 500 people had seen the risen Jesus, and that most were still alive when he wrote, available to be questioned dire. 50 days after Passover on Pentecost, something happened that Caiaphas could not contain. Peter, the same man who denied Jesus 3 times on the night of the trial, who fled like everyone else, who spent days hiding behind locked doors out of fear, stood up in the middle of Jerusalem and preached to thousands. 3,000 responded that day. Not in Nazareth, not in some distant city, right in Jerusalem, the very place where the crucifixion had happened weeks before. The threat had not been eliminated, it had multiplied. Caiaphas summoned Peter and John before the Sanhedrin. Acts 4 captures that moment with a clarity that shows how far things had slipped from his control. The man who had presided over Jesus' nighttime trial with total confidence now faced two uneducated Galilean fishermen with no formal schooling, no political connections, and none of the authority markers that Caiaphas' world recognized, and he could not shut them up. The text records something honest in its discomfort. The Sanhedrin members recognized that these men had been with Jesus. There was something about them they couldn't explain away, a confidence that didn't come from education or social standing, an authority that wasn't theirs. Caiaphas sent them off with threats, had them arrested, released them, arrested them again. Each attempt to silence them made the movement grow. Every arrest became a piece of evidence against him. The year was 36 AD. The same year, Pontius Pilate massacred Samaritans at Mount Gerizim and was removed by Vitellius, the Roman legate of Syria. Vitellius came to Jerusalem and did two things: removed Pilate and stripped Caiaphas of the high priesthood. Both men who had collaborated to condemn Jesus were removed by the same Roman official in the same year through the same administrative process. The historical irony carries a precision no screenwriter would dare invent. Caiaphas had held office for 18 years, outlasted 4 Roman emperors, navigated the most turbulent currents of Jewish politics with a skill very few had matched. And he was removed with the same cold efficiency Rome used for any inconvenient official. No drama, no formal hearing, just one line in a Roman administrative order. And the most powerful man in Israel stopped being that. The system he had faithfully served for 18 years disposed of him without a second thought. In November 1990, construction workers in a park south of Jerusalem accidentally broke open an ancient burial chamber. Inside were 12 ossuaries, the limestone boxes that first-century Jews used to store the bones of the dead after the body had decomposed. One immediately caught the archaeologists' attention when they arrived, the most ornate in the chamber, decorated with elaborate floral carvings reserved for people of high standing. Engraved on the stone was a name, inscriptions with variations of the same name: Joseph bar Caiaphas, Joseph son of Caiaphas. Inside the ossuary were the bones of 6 individuals, including those of a man approximately 60 years old, identified by archaeologists as most likely being Caiaphas himself. The ossuary was dated to the 1st century AD and is now on display at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Anyone can go see the stone box that held the bones of the man who presided over the trial of Jesus. This discovery was extraordinary for a reason that goes well beyond archaeology. For centuries, critics of the Gospels argued that many named characters were literary inventions or inflated minor figures. Caiaphas, like Pilate before the Pilate stone was found in 1961, was one of those contested cases. The 1990 ossuary ended that debate definitively. The man existed, the name matches, the period matches, the social standing fits the office he held for 18 years. The story of Caiaphas is the story of a man who had everything the world considers necessary for lasting power: political intelligence, experience, connections, pragmatism, the ability to make hard decisions without hesitation. 18 years surviving in a role that had broken every recent predecessor. And with all of that, he made the most consequentially wrong decision in human history, not from recklessness, but from being too precise in a calculation missing one variable. He calculated political consequences. He calculated crowd reaction. He calculated Pilate's response. He calculated the risk of an uprising during Passover. He had calculated far more complex political moves over 18 years, and won every single time. But he did not calculate the resurrection, and when the stone rolled and the tomb was empty, none of his instruments of power were the right tool for the kind of problem now standing in front of him for the very first time in his life. When witnesses kept surfacing from every direction, Caiaphas tried to do what he had always done: manage the narrative, buy silence, use power to suppress what could not be explained. For the first time in his life, power simply was not enough, because what he had tried to bury in a sealed, guarded tomb was not a political problem, it was a person. And that person had walked out of the tomb on his own terms, leaving everything Caiaphas had carefully built fully exposed. There is something in this story worth pausing on and letting sink in. Caiaphas had more information about Jesus than any other living person at that moment. He had interrogated him personally. He had heard with his own ears the answer that led him to tear his robes. He had received the guard's report about the empty tomb. He had seen with his own eyes what Peter and John had become after Pentecost. He had every piece of information available, and he deliberately chose not to change. He chose not to change because changing meant losing everything built over 18 years. The office, the influence, the network, the identity that had become inseparable from the position, and the cost of losing power felt in that moment greater than the cost of being wrong about God. That is the part of Caiaphas's story that doesn't belong only to the first century. It is a logic that spans centuries, one that any honest person recognizes somewhere inside themselves. The ossuary on display in Jerusalem is more than archaeological confirmation. It is the final portrait of a man who stood before the greatest revelation in history and chose power instead. Not from ignorance, from cold calculation. Not from lack of evidence, from too much invested in what the evidence threatened to destroy. Caiaphas had the right name, right office, right moment, and right information. He had everything, except the willingness to let truth cost him something. The question this story raises is not really about Caiaphas. It is about anyone who has ever faced an inconvenient truth. The kind that, if accepted, would completely reshape their priorities, their relationships, and the identity they spent years building. Caiaphas is not a distant figure from 2,000 years ago. He is a 2 millennia-old mirror reflecting a choice that human beings keep making in different versions at different scales throughout their entire lives. Have you ever been in a position where you had all the information needed to make the right call, but the cost of changing felt too steep? Where the truth was clear, but accepting it meant letting go of something that had become part of who you believed you were. Caiaphas had the high priesthood. You might have a relationship, a long-held belief, or a version of yourself that would need rethinking. The structure is exactly the same. So is the choice that follows from it. History records the ossuary with Caiaphas's name. It records the bones. It records the end. But it cannot record what would have been different if that remarkably capable man had looked at the empty tomb and chosen a different response. The man who had navigated the most turbulent currents of Jewish politics for 18 years could have become the most powerful witness of the first century, instead of the most precise example of how power can blind even the most intelligent people. If this story connected with something in you, subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with someone who appreciates biblical history with real depth. Every video here is a deep dive into the layers most books never show. The real story behind the sacred story, with all the archaeology, all the geography, and all the human weight biblical figures carried when they lived what they lived. The Bible was right about Caiaphas, and it keeps being right about a whole lot more.